Why isn't reincarnation in the Bible? Was it ever? Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, clairvoyant and healer, reveals the startling truth. It was. Here Cayce reveals the hidden history of reincarnation and of its removal, along with the original Gospels. You will learn the players and their names, their moves, and their motives.
This excerpt comes from the book Edgar Cayce on Reincarnation. Why isn't reincarnation in the Bible? The Hidden History of Reincarnation, read by 31 Pearls. Our Orthodox versions of the Old and New Testament date no further back than the 6th century, when Byzantine Emperor Justinian summoned the Fifth Ecumenical Congress of Constantinople in 553 AD to condemn the platonically inspired writings of Origen. Contrary to the belief of our contemporary churches, this was not an unsecular congress. The Pope was forbidden to attend, and his denunciation of it was flouted. It was instigated by the same substratum of moronic barbarians who had, quote-unquote, converted to Christianity under Constantine. If the reader should find it singular that this Congress is given so much attention in the following pages, it is because the events which led up to the Fifth Congress represent practically the only surviving evidence as to why reincarnation disappeared from the Bible. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian, 483 to 565, as a fatherless youth, was brought up in austere obscurity by his mother and his uncle, the peasant Emperor Justin, while they rigidly groomed him to inherit the throne of Constantinople. The severity of his upbringing was responsible for an arid, erratic streak in him. He early developed an intellectual passion for law that is hardly commensurate with normal adolescence. And though he considered himself essentially a good man, he was easily swayed by flattery, and his judgment of his fellow men remained superficial and immature. Only in his intuitive grasp of military strategy was he consistent. His youthful general Belisarius successfully subdued the Ostrogoths in Italy and the Vandals in Africa, thus restoring the foundering Roman Empire to a modicum of its former power. Byzantine architecture flowered under Justinian, and he revised Roman law to the extent that it subsequently became the basis for all Western civil law. On the face of it, he should have risen to the heights of Charlemagne. That he did not was due in part to his temperament, an incompatible mixture of dedicated zealotry and infirmity of purpose, and in part to his deterioration to the rank of pawn in a ruthless woman's bid for self-destruction. Theodora, 508 to 547, the commoner who became Justinian's empress, wielded sufficient authority over contemporary records to suppress most of the evidence of her dubious background. And her only contemporary biographer, Procopius, so bitterly detested her that his secret history is rejected in as many academic quarters as it is accepted in others. It is generally agreed that Theodora was the daughter of a bear feeder in the amphitheatre in Constantinople, and made her debut as a child actress at a time when that profession ranked with the world's oldest. Of this, too, she rapidly became an accomplished member. And her insatiable ambition made capital of the obstacles that confronted her. Theodora's strategy was always to create a condition of organized confusion in which every man eventually found himself in conflict with his neighbor, enabling her to divide and conquer at her leisure. Once she had become Justinian's mistress, she set her stakes even higher. She determined to become his empress. And though Justinian's mother opposed her with all the power at her command, Justinian proved to be too emotionally unstable to resist such a blitzkrieg. Where his knowledge of his fellow men was faulty and erratic, Theodora was expert and innately predatory. Where he vacillated, she was as inflexible as iron. Although the law forbade men above senatorial rank to marry actresses, the law was conveniently abolished by Justinian on the death of his mother, and Theodora took her place beside him on the throne. There is nothing historically unique about an unworldly monarch reduced to thraldom by a ruthless courtesan. but few courtesans in history possessed Theodora's diabolism. Witness the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Officials took an oath of allegiance to her, as well as to the emperor. The city was full of her spies, who reported to her everything said against herself or the administration. She surrounded herself with ceremonious pomp, and required all who approached to abase themselves in a manner new even to that half-Orient court. According to Procopius, she had before her marriage become the mother of a son, who, when grown up, returned from Arabia, revealed himself to her, and forthwith disappeared forever. In very short order, she became a tyrant in the grand manner of the more psychotic Caesars. Her favourites catapulted to power, and her enemies died in such numbers that eventually the public rose up against the royal couple, confronted by the Nika insurrections of 532. Justinian, terrified and demoralised, would have fled before it. But the indomitable Theodora preferred death to obscurity. She made him sweat it out, and the riots were finally subdued. After that, Justinian was no more impressive than a glove puppet on her strong right hand, and she was free to concentrate her energies on the most formidable of her foes, the Church of Rome. Theodora saw the Christian Church as her equivalent of the Great Pyramid, an eternal monument to her ego. And to ensure its permanency, she set about the total reconstitution of its credenda, which were far too sublime for her purposes. That she actually succeeded was due to the fact that the Vatican had barely had time to recover from its subjugation by Theodoric the Ostrogoth, before it found itself under the over-solicitous police protection of Belisarius's army of occupation. Her first and most influential teacher, Eutyches, a devotee of the Eastern Church, first emerged when Theodora was the mistress of Hesebulus, the governor of Pentapolis in northern Africa. When Hesebulus eventually threw her out of the city, Theodora and Eutyches gravitated first to Alexandria and then to Constantinople. She, as an ascending power in the lists of profane love, and he as the doyen of a series of monophysite, religious schools. The Monophysite Doctrine. The Monophysite doctrine is, as it were, the villain of the piece. It was this sect that was later to discredit all allusion to reincarnation in the early Gospels, and split the Church into two warring factions. It must be remembered that not only had an unending series of conflicting schisms plagued the solidarity of the Christian Church from about 300 AD onward, but it also faced active resistance and sturdy competition from the pagan religions it had not yet superseded, many of which were not only gayer and more escapist, they even threw in the odd Saturnalia. Now, the Monophysites added to the confusion by contending that Jesus' physical body was wholly divine, and had never, at any time, combined divine and human attributes. It seemed to cause them no embarrassment that Jesus himself had declared that there was a spark of the divine in every human soul. They adhered militantly to their conviction that the mere act of donning the outer trappings of a mortal body would have defiled Jesus' true origin. Unfortunately, under the influence of Eutyches, Theodora became a convert to this controversial monophysite dogma. Its principal claim to her affections was its total rejection of those teachings of Origen, which had so profoundly influenced the early Church Fathers. Origen not only believed in metempsychosis, but argued that Christ the Logos, or Word, inhabited the human body of Jesus, thus sanctifying it. It is fair to assume that Theodora conscripted two of her most devoted deacons, Vigilius and Anthimus, on the suggestion, if not the insistence, of Eutyches to this viewpoint. It is difficult today, when one wades through these laborious arguments between the eastern and western branches of the Church over the divinity of Christ, to realize the manic antagonism they aroused in both camps. The Monophysites continued to provoke strife and discord until the year 451, when a specially summoned church council, loyal to Origen's teachings, split Christ into two separate natures, human and divine. The Chalcedonian Decree, 451 AD. The well-intentioned decision, known as the Chalcedonian Decree, while protecting the teachings of Origen, became in effect the launching pad for all the black mischief that followed.
Indeed, the split between the Monophysites and the Vatican reached such violent proportions that one of Justinian's first public acts was to make the Patriarch of Constantinople declare his full adhesion to the Creed of Chalcedon, Encyclopaedia Britannica. This constitutes solid evidence that prior to Theodora's arrival on the scene, Justinian was in complete sympathy with the Origenist leanings of the Church of Rome. Yet in 543, at Theodora's urging, he permitted a local synod to discredit and condemn the writings of Origen. Very much as the hero of Orwell's 1984, quote-unquote, purified the public files of the newspapers by rewriting political history and eliminating all reference to previous Big Brothers, Theodora now pursued a campaign designed to obliterate all and any passages in the Bible which might reduce to absurdity
her hopes of instant apotheosis upon departing this life.
Anthemus. Theodora's first move in her grand strategy was to subdue and unify the various feuding factions of the Eastern Church until it was utterly under her domination. In open defiance of the Vatican Protocol, she appointed her lackey Anthemus as Patriarch of Constantinople. Now Anthemus is a minor figure in the overall picture, but he was equipped for great mischief at this moment. Theodora had appointed him for the express purpose of revoking the Chalcedonian Decree. Justinian's role, as usual, was to plead ignorance of the whole affair and play Pilate. At once, she ran afoul of Pope Agapetus. Pope Agapetus. This dignified old worthy travelled from Rome to Constantinople in bleak February weather, and when he discovered the full enormity of Theodora's intent, he became the only prelate ever to denounce her
in Constantine's presence.
With eager longing, he informed the outraged Justinian, "Have I come to gaze on the most Christian Emperor Justinian? In his place I find a Diocletian, whose threat, however, terrify me not." This unexpected rap on the royal nose pulled Justinian up short, and being fully convinced that Anthemus was unsound in faith, he made no exception to the Pope's exercising the plenitude of his powers in disposing and suspending the intruder Anthemus, and for the first time in the history of the Church, personally consecrating his legally elected successor, Menas, Catholic Encyclopedia. Unfortunately for the spiritual destiny of Europe, the saintly and incorruptible Agapetus died in the same year 536. But he leaves a nobler and more honourable record behind him than any of the other participants in this sorry charade. His expedient demise followed his triumph so swiftly that one can only assume that Theodora was instrumental in speeding him to a happier world. With Agapetus dead, Menas was easily brought to heel and accommodatingly condemned the entire diocese of Origenism in the emperor's name. From this point on, Justinian obediently sanctioned all Theodora's further purges of Origenism. Pope Silverius. It seems relevant at this point to illustrate from a completely independent source, the Vita Silvae, just how malevolent Theodora's self-deification had become. Because the empress was grieving for the patriarch Anthemus, the most holy Pope Agapetus having disposed him on the grounds of heresy and replaced him with Vigilius. She sent this letter to Agapetus's successor, Pope Silverius, at Rome. "Make no delay in coming to us, or without fail recall Anthemus to his own place." And when blessed Silverius had read this, he groaned and said, "I know very well that this affair has brought an end to my life," but replied by letter to the empress, Mistress Augusta, I shall never consent to do such a thing as to reinstate a man who is a heretic and who has been condemned in his own wickedness. Then the Empress, in a fury, sent orders to the patrician Belisarius by the deacon Vigilius. Seek out some grounds of complaint against the Pope Silverius that will remove him from the office of bishop, or at least send him quickly to us. You have there the Archdeacon Vigilius, our most beloved deputy, who has promised us to recall the Patriarch Anthimus. The patrician Belisarius undertook the commission, and under urgent orders, certain false witnesses issued forth and actually made the statement that they had discovered the Pope Silverius sending messages to the king of the Goths. Upon hearing this, Belarius refused belief, knowing that these reports were motivated by envy. But when many more persisted in this same accusation, he became afraid. Therefore, he caused the blessed Pope Silverius to come to him in the Pincian Palace, and he stationed all the clergy at the first and second entrances. And when Silverius and Virgilius had come alone into the salon, the patrician Antonina was reclining on a couch and her husband Belisarius was seated at her feet. Antonina said at once, "Tell me, Master Silverius, Pope, what have we done to you and the Romans that you wish to betray us into the hands of the Goths?" And even while she was speaking these words, there entered John, the regional subdeacon of the First Ward, who lifted the blessed Pope Silverius's collar from his neck and led him into a chamber. There he unfrocked him, put on him monk's garb, and spirited him away. And Vigilius took him under his personal protection, as it were, and sent him to exile in Pontus, where he sustained him with the bread of tribulation and water of necessity. And he weakened and died, and became a confessor. Theodora now stood revealed in her true colours, and her next move was her most ferocious so far. She became the only empress in history to succeed in enthroning her own pope, Vigilius, in Rome in 538. She had, in effect, ascended the papal throne in person, and it is more than likely that this is the source of the legend of the mythical Pope Joan. Before we turn our attention to the eyewitness accounts supplied by Procopius, it is fitting to preface them with one last excerpt from an independent source. Among the accredited historian of Byzantine history of this era are three of importance: Agathias, 530 to 582, John Lydus, 490 to 565, and Evagrius, 536 to 594. Evagrius, in his ecclesiastical history, makes this comment: "There was also another quality latent in the character of Justinian, a depravity which exceeded any bestiality which can be imagined. And whether this was a defect of his natural character, or whether it was the outgrowth of cowardice and fear, I am unable to say. But in any case, it manifested itself as a result of the popular Nika insurrection. Here is a side of the emperor which Procopius documents in detail, yet it is discreetly ignored in the standard references, most of which content themselves with discrediting Procopius outright. The Secret History by Procopius. The version of the Anecdota, or Secret History, from which we now quote, is one of 7 volumes, which include The History of the Wars and History of the Buildings, Harvard University Press, translated by H.B. Dewing in 1935. According to Dewing, the personable and well-educated Procopius arrived in Constantinople from Caesarea in Palestine, while still a young man. Almost at once he was appointed legal advisor and private secretary to the patrician Belisarius, Justinian's youngest and most illustrious general. This is hardly a privilege accorded, an anonymous scribbler of salacious gossip. Indeed, we are immediately confronted by an unexpectedly articulate and imposing figure, the official historian of Justinian's 3 wars, against the Persians, the Vandals and the Goths respectively, in which capacity he travelled in the personal entourage of Belisarius and observed the wars first-hand.
Besides his intimacy with Belisarius, says Dewing, it should be added that his position gave him the further advantage of a certain standing at the imperial court of Constantinople and brought him the acquaintance of many of the leading men of his day. Thus we have the testimony of one intimately associated with the administration. One must admit, the imperial favour was not won by plain speaking. Nevertheless, we have before us a man who could not obliterate himself enough to play the abject flatterer always. And he gives us the reverse too, of this brilliant picture, in the Anecdota or Secret History. Here he freed himself of all the restraints of respect or fear, and set down, without scruple, everything which he had been led to suppress or gloss over in the history of the wars, through motives of policy. It is a record of wanton crime and shameless debauchery of intrigue and scandal, both in public and private life. We seem to hear one speak out of the bitterness of his heart. It should be said at the same time that there are very few contradictions of fact. It was the intention of Procopius to write a book on the doctrines of Christianity and the long and often bitter debates, in the course of which these were formulated, as he definitely states in chapter 11 of the Secret History, a promise which he repeated in the 8th book of the Histories, 25. It is most unfortunate that he was prevented from fulfilling this promise, for his point of view was that of a liberal who was puzzled by the earnestness with which his contemporaries entered into the discussion of these matters. Even a cursory study of the war histories reveals Procopius not only as a diligent and meticulous chronicler, but conscientious to such a degree that he was prepared to risk the ire of Justinian by rightfully crediting Belisarius with the success of the 3 campaigns. If he promised to write a treatise on the religious confusion of the time, it is more than possible that he did write it. The fact that it is missing does not necessarily point to foul play by his enemies. When one recalls the widowed Lady Burton burning her husband's exotic translations from the Arabic to keep his memory pure, even so, we cannot ignore the fact that Procopius's History of the Church could have been so explosive in content that a timid bibliophile, discovering it on some forgotten shelf, would be impelled to deliver it into the hands of the authorities rather than offer it for sale to a private collector. It was, after all, a private collector who discovered the Anecdota manuscript in Rome in the mid-19th century. Written in Greek and intact, it had obviously been lovingly protected for more than 1400 years. But as far as we may ever know, the history of the Church vanished as utterly as the imperial court archives in Constantinople, which did not even survive the remorse-ridden senility of Justinian. Those gifted with the patience to endure the archaism of Procopius's style will find that a series of very real, convincing portraits will emerge from the secret history as distinct from the expedient effigies which adorn the standard references. It will even become apparent that the accounts of Justinian's insomnia and schizoid outbursts have a disturbingly familiar ring. They follow the same behaviour patterns as Hitler's, a fact which would have been inaccessible to Dewing in 1935, the year he completed his translation. A portrait of Theodora. Procopius supplies such a vivid first-hand account of Theodora's sexual promiscuity that most of it is too disgusting for inclusion here. Although when it is measured against the excesses of the more degenerate Caesars, it is credible enough. He then continues with a description of her after she became empress. Now Theodora was fair of face and in general attractive in appearance, but short of stature and lacking in colour. Being, however, not altogether pale but rather sallow, and her glance was always intense and made with contracted brows. She lavished more care on her body than was necessary, but never as much as she considered adequate. For instance, she used to enter the bath very early and quit it very late, and go thence to her breakfast. After partaking of breakfast,
she would rest. At luncheon and dinner, however, she partook incontinently of food and drink, so that sleep would constantly lay hold of her for long stretches of time, not only in the daytime up to nightfall, but at night up to sunrise. And although she indulged herself in every excess for so major a portion of the day, she still claimed the right to administer the whole Roman Empire, and if the emperor should impose any favour upon a man without her consent, that man's affairs would suffer such a turn of fortune that not long thereafter he would be dismissed from his office with the greatest indignities, and would die a most shameful death, all of which has the ring of first-hand reporting of a highly responsible order. A portrait of Justinian. Procopius then presents in detail his theory that both Theodora and Justinian were possessed by demons, and here the same manic disorders that distinguished Hitler come into sharp focus, even if the language of that time lacked the advantage of modern psychiatric idiom. And I think it not inappropriate here to describe the appearance of this man. He was neither tall in stature nor particularly short, but of medium height, yet not thin but slightly fleshy, and his face was round and not uncomely, for his complexion remained ruddy even after 2 days of fasting. But his character I could not accurately describe, for this man was both an evil-doer and easily led into evil. A perfect artist in acting out an opinion which he pretended to hold, and even able to produce tears, not from joy or sorrow, but contriving them for the occasion, according to the need of the moment. Always playing false, yet not carelessly, but adding both his signature and the most terrible oaths to bind his agreements, and that too, in dealing with his own subjects. And they say a certain monk who was very dear to God set out to Byzantium in order to plead the cause of the people living near the monastery who were being wronged in unbearable fashion. And immediately upon his arrival, he was granted admittance to the emperor. But just as he was about to enter his presence, having already placed one foot across the threshold, he suddenly recoiled and stepped back. Now the eunuch who was his conductor, as well as others nearby, besought him earnestly to go forward, but he, acting like a man who had suffered a stroke, made no answer, but departed thence, and went to the place where he was lodged. And when his attendants inquired why he had acted thus, he declared outright that he had seen the Lord of the Demons sitting on the throne, and had declined to suffer his presence long enough to ask anything from him. And how could this man fail to be some wicked demon, who never had sufficiency of food or drink or sleep, but taking a haphazard taste of whatever was set before him, walked about the palace at unseasonable hours of the night, though he was passionately devoted to the joys of Aphrodite. He was not given to sleep as a general thing, and he never filled himself to repletion with either food or drink, but he usually just touched the food with the tips of his fingers and went his way. Justinian's split personality is shrewdly and articulately observed in the following. However, he did not on that account blush before any of those destined to be ruined by him. Indeed, he never allowed himself to show anger or exasperation, thus to reveal his feelings to those who had given offence, but with gentle mien and lowered brow, and in restrained voice he would give orders for the death of thousands of innocent men, for the dismantling of cities, and for the confiscation of all moneys to the treasury, and one would infer from this characteristic that he had the spirit of the Lamb. Yet, if anyone sought to intercede through prayers and supplications for those who had given offence, thus to gain for them forgiveness, then, enraged and showing his teeth, he would seem to be ready to burst, so that none of those who were supposed to be intimate with him had any further hope of obtaining the desired pardon, and while he seemed to have a firm belief as regards Christ, yet even this was for the ruin of his subjects. For in his eagerness to gather all men into one belief as to Christ, he kept destroying the rest of mankind in senseless fashion, and that too, while acting with pretense of piety. for it did not seem to him murder if the victims chanced to be not of his own creed. And I shall show further how many other calamities chanced to befall, which some insisted came about through the aforementioned presence of this evil demon, and through his contriving, while others said that the deity, detesting his works, turned away from the Roman Empire and gave place to the abominable demons for the bringing of these things to pass in this fashion. Thus, the Scirtus River, by overflowing Edessa, became the author of countless calamities to the people of that region, as will be written by me in a following book. And earthquakes destroyed Antioch, the first city of the East, and Seleucia, which is close to it, as well as the most notable city in Cilicia, Anazarbus. And the number of persons who perished along with these cities, who would be able to compute. And one might add to the list Ibora and also Amasia, which chanced to be the first city in Pontus, also Polybotus in Phrygia, and the city which the Pisidians call Philomede, and Lychnidus in Epirus, and Corinth. And afterwards came the plague as well, mentioned by me before, which carried off about 1/2 of the surviving population. Substitute the Allied bombing raids of Germany in World War II for the natural disasters, and Hitler's voices for the demons which possessed Justinian, and the parallel is neither fortuitous nor far-fetched. Procopius has drawn 2 very real portraits, and it seems unconvincing to reduce his observations to malicious chatter. The Fifth Ecumenical Church Council. Theodora, having contrived the murder of 2 popes, expected to instill their successor Vigilius with her own mania, for exterminating all traces of the Chalcedonian decree and its division of Christ into 2 separate entities, human and divine. She failed. What caused her death no one seems to know for certain. The Encyclopaedia Britannica, finally giving Procopius the benefit of the doubt, set the date in 547. One thing is certain. Justinian continued to conduct his affairs exactly as if she still stood at his elbow. He was determined to deify her and himself, by totally obliterating any facet of the Christian religion that might in any way disqualify such a grotesque conceit. What religious doctrine could possibly have deranged him more than reincarnation's dispassionate law of cause and effect? What other law could obliterate both his and his consort's imperial status at the moment of death, reduce them both to the common denominator of backward souls, and then bundle them back into lives of abject atonement to balance the scales? The 3 Chapters Edict. Justinian's opening gambit was to disinter a toothless and forgotten civil law passed in 531, called the 3 Chapters Edict. This had lashed out indiscriminately at 3 long-defunct heretical author-bishops, Theodore, Theodret, and Ibar. This unimposing edict had apparently alarmed no one except Vigilius at the time, and now, in 553, his fears were fully confirmed when Justinian found it necessary to convene the lumbering weight of the Fifth Ecumenical Church Council, to incorporate this very minor tempest in a teapot into canon law. When he went so far as to exclude all but 6 Western bishops from the council, while permitting the attendance of 159 Eastern bishops, all of them, presumably, faithful Monophysites. Justinian provoked Vigilius to belated but courageous action. Pope Vigilius demanded that the Eastern and Western bishops be given equal representation, a demand that was promptly and predictably quashed by Justinian. Robbed, then, of his last shreds of superficial authority, Pope Vigilius refused to attend the council, though his motive might have been less loyalty to the Vatican than self-preservation. Justinian was not above hastening his end with the same dispatch that had been meted out to Agapetus and Silverius. If the Church of Rome had not been powerless to oppose the military supremacy of Byzantium, Vigilius could have forbidden Justinian to convene the Fifth Council on pain of excommunication. Again, If there had been a bit more of the stuff of martyrs in Vigilius, he might have aroused sufficient protest in the West to make Justinian think twice. For the emperor would have been in no haste to provoke a public uprising on the scale of the Nika insurrection of 523, which was still raw in his mind. Unfortunately, like Becket, his past was against him. He found himself at odds, both with the ill-omened pyrotechnics of his master and his own conscience. There is something stupefying in the haphazard lack of concern for keeping of the council's records. None were kept. When the council ended in an atmosphere suitably obscured by organised confusion and high-sounding bombast, Justinian officially announced that the council's sole purpose in convening was to legalise the well-worn 3 chapters edict, and that this was now accomplished. Pope Vigilius was served official notice that the 3 chapters edict was now law, and so, to all intents and purposes, the council had fulfilled its declared function, and the bishops departed. Now the 3 chapters edict in itself was very small political beer. If that had been Justinian's only concern, he could easily have had it incorporated into canon law, without the recourse to the elaborate machinery of a full-scale ecumenical council. This was like chopping down a whole orchard to pick one apple. If, on the other hand, the emperor's purpose was to delete all reference to metempsychosis from the original Gospels, he most certainly would have needed the imposing might of the Fifth Council to cloak his mischief. What exactly was the real purpose of the Congress? It was to condemn the writings of Origen, the immediate effect of which would of course be the obliteration of the Chalcedonian decree of 451. It is therefore imperative that we never confuse the Chalcedonian decree of 451 with the ridiculous 3 chapters edict of 531. For the sleight of hand of the Fifth Council was designed to deceive the eye in exactly this fashion. Who really instigated the council? The unquiet wraith of Theodora. It was her posthumous coup d'état to the autonomy of the Western Church in Rome. The Monophysites were henceforth to realign the Church from their eastern stronghold. In brief, concealed beneath all the pomp and circumstance of the Fifth Council, there was a witch hunt in full cry, and its victim was reincarnation, in all its Platonist, Origenist, secular and unsecular forms. Yet, emperor or no emperor, Justinian was a layman tampering with ecclesiastical law. The titular head of the Roman Church had been refused admittance to the council, and only 6 Western bishops had been permitted to vote. The findings of the council did, of course, annihilate Origenism in the Christian Church, even if a few stubborn sects, notably the troubadours of southern France who went underground for a few more centuries. Moreover, the attack on Origen now stood revealed as an attack on all the early Church Fathers, whose writings reflected their veneration of him. Copies of their works were not numerous and could easily be tracked down and expurgated. The early Gospels were either in Latin or Greek and were never allowed to fall into the hands of laymen. Few, if any, monasteries would have had the courage to defy their emperor and hide their original versions. The imperial spy system was as efficient and thorough as any conceived by Stalin or Hitler. It would have possessed detailed records of all the religious libraries. Justinian's deletions and alterations of the Gospels would have been completed in very short order, and so would the elimination of all and any evidence of the vandalism. Even so, certain questions remain stubbornly unanswerable. Surely, if Pope Vigilius had not felt assured that the Western Church was solidly behind him, he would never have taken on Justinian. Yet he did oppose the council. If we are expected to believe that the full sympathy of the Western bishops was fully behind the Monophysite dogma, why should Justinian have gone to such lengths to bar them from the Fifth Council? Surely he would have welcomed them in. By what process did the Vatican eventually arrive at the conclusion that their Pope had voluntarily approved the anathemas and officially accepted them as canon law? The absence of all but 6 Western bishops at the council was hardly calculated to instill into the heart of the Mother Church a sudden trust in its bitterest foes, Theodora and Justinian. Was the Vatican prepared to submit to their intimidation for all eternity? Fear of Theodora's avenging arm is understandable during her lifetime. But in his old age, Justinian disintegrated into a demoralized dotard, repenting his ways and desperately seeking absolution. Why was the issue never re-examined by a properly authorized ecumenical council? The Catholic Encyclopedia informs us that Vigilius and the 4 popes who followed him gave recognition only to the 3 chapters edict when referring to the council, and speak of Origenism as if they knew nothing of its condemnation. 500 years later, in 1054, the Roman and Greek Church excommunicated each other. Surely no division of ideologies could be more total. But yet another puzzling aspect of the suppression is the ambivalence shown by the Greek Church at the Council of Florence during the Renaissance. George Gemistus, attending as the Greek Church's deputy, urged Cosimo de' Medici, then at the height of his power, to form a Platonic academy in Florence. This served to introduce metempsychosis into European philosophy. Even though the Church remained firmly uninvolved, Voltaire's caustic comment that today Roman Catholics believe only in the councils approved in the Vatican, and Greek Orthodox Catholics believe only in those approved in Constantinople, implies an ironic reversal of loyalties to Platonism. Rome had to condemn it before the Greeks would condone it, even if they too still excluded it from their creed. This is tantamount to saying that the real findings of the Council, never having been submitted to the Church of Rome, were therefore never ratified by it. The Council had been no more than an elaborate thimble-rig to conceal a much more intimate conclave, which had been held in secret a few days earlier. In this secret Kabbalah, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the bishops already assembled at Constantinople had to consider, by order of the emperor, a form of Origenism that had practically nothing in common with Origen, but which was held, we know, by one of the Origenist parties in Palestine. The encyclopedia concludes with the statement that the bishops obediently subscribed to the 15 anathemas proposed by the emperor against Origen, and that Theodore of Scythopolin, an admitted Origenist, was forced to retract. But, and we may attach the most vital significance to the following, there is no proof that the approbation of the Pope, who was at the time protesting against the convocation of the council, was asked. It is easy to understand how this extra conciliatory sentence was mistaken at a later period for a decree of the actual ecumenical council. For whom is it easy to understand? During the nearly 1400 years which have elapsed since the council, no ecclesiastical authority has subjected the problem to examination, or even evinced the slightest desire to do so. Head and Cranston, in their Reincarnation, an East-West anthology, supply this cogent summing up. It seems clear that Catholic scholars are beginning to disclaim that the Roman Church took any part in the anathemas against Origen, suggesting that during the many centuries when the Church believed it had condemned Origen, it was mistaken. However, one disastrous result of the mistake still persists, namely, the exclusion from the Christian creed of the teaching of the pre-existence of the soul, and by implication, reincarnation. End of the reading of Chapter 11 of Edgar Cayce on the Hidden History of Reincarnation. An additional note from 31 Pearls. There is one passage left in the New Testament that offers evidence of reincarnation. In Matthew, chapter 17, verses 11, 12, and 13, Jesus answered, "Elijah does come and get everything ready. I'm telling you, Elijah has already come, but they didn't know him when they saw him, They treated him like dirt, the same way they are about to treat the Son of Man. That's when the disciples realized that all along he had been talking about John the Baptizer. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like, comment, and be sure to turn on notifications.